I didn't begin this research trying to prove the existence of a lost civilization. That was never the goal. But the deeper I looked into the architectural remains, the industrial artifacts, and the surviving photographs from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, something began to feel off. Not just what was present in the historical record, but what was missing. There were gaps, large ones, and eventually I realized something deeply unsettling. The story we've been told about daily life in the 19th century doesn't fully match the physical evidence that still surrounds us today. Look closely at the buildings that remain, the infrastructure beneath our streets, the photographs preserved in archives. They show a world that appears far more sophisticated than the one described in conventional history. So I started asking a different question. Instead of asking whether Tartaria existed, I began wondering something else entirely. What would daily life have actually looked like inside the civilization that built these structures? Because the official narrative describes the 1800s as a time of primitive living, people traveling by horse, communicating slowly by letter, constructing buildings with simple tools, and struggling through a largely pre-industrial world. Yet, when you examine what still remains, the roads perfectly graded, the canals precisely engineered, the buildings mathematically exact, a very different picture begins to emerge. Not a world of primitive struggle, but a world of coordination. Not isolation, but connection. Not simplicity, but complex systems we may no longer fully understand. So imagine waking up in a city during that era, not the romanticized version of the past we often see in movies, but the actual physical spaces that still exist today. You wake in an apartment building with ceilings 12, 14, sometimes 16 feet high, heights far beyond what would be practical for heating or simple living. The windows stretch nearly from floor to ceiling, so tall they almost seem designed for something other than ordinary human proportions. Light pours in, not randomly, but through windows positioned with remarkable consistency, aligned with solar angles that shift with the seasons. The buildings themselves seem to respond to natural forces, sunlight, wind, airflow, even water movement. It's an approach to architecture that modern construction rarely considers. Inside these rooms, intricate plasterwork flows across the ceilings like frozen water. Crown moldings display craftsmanship so detailed that modern artisans might spend months replicating a single section. And yet these same patterns appear across thousands of buildings, in dozens of cities, on multiple continents. Official history tells us these structures were built independently by countless contractors. Yet somehow they all arrived at nearly identical designs. How does that happen? Step outside onto the streets, and the questions only multiply. These weren't simple dirt roads or loosely placed cobblestones. Many were carefully graded thoroughfares with drainage systems sophisticated enough that some still function more than a century later. Storm drains connect to underground networks stretching for miles. Sewage systems operate with engineering that rivals modern designs. And the streets themselves are often wider than necessary for horse-drawn traffic. They align with cardinal directions with such precision that coincidence becomes difficult to accept. When you examine city layouts from above, another pattern appears. Grand boulevards radiating outward from central points, forming geometric patterns, star shapes, radial designs, symmetrical grids. These layouts appear again and again in cities around the world. Patterns like these don't emerge accidentally. They suggest planning, surveying, coordination on a massive scale. Then there's transportation. Photographs from the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s show streets already filled with organized movement. Streetcars running along rails, cable systems pulling cars uphill, omnibuses traveling fixed routes. This wasn't chaotic medieval congestion. It looked like an organized transit system. By the 1880s, street railways existed in hundreds of cities. Cable cars required massive underground machinery. Elevated trains appeared in major urban centers. All of this demanded engineering knowledge, financial investment, and centralized planning. But when you search the historical record for the organizations that coordinated such systems, the answers are surprisingly thin, and the streets were only one part of the network. The canals may be even more puzzling. Across Europe, Asia, and North America, Thousands of canals once connected cities, towns, and industrial centers. They weren't random waterways, they were precisely engineered systems. Locks controlled water levels, reservoirs regulated seasonal flow, pumping stations moved water uphill when necessary. China's Grand Canal stretched over 1,000 miles. The Netherlands and Belgium maintained hundreds of miles of interconnected waterways. Britain developed nearly 4,000 miles of navigable canals in only a few decades. This wasn't primitive infrastructure. It was systems engineering. Barges moved massive quantities of grain, raw materials, and manufactured goods through these waterways every day. Coordinated schedules allowed goods to travel across entire regions efficiently. Maintaining these networks required constant monitoring, water levels, lock synchronization, seasonal adjustments. Which raises a difficult question. Where did the expertise come from? Why do these systems appear almost fully formed, with little evidence of trial and error? And canals weren't the only long-distance networks. Overland trade routes, like the famous Silk Road, were far more than wandering merchant trails. They functioned as organized corridors with stations positioned at precise intervals. Caravanserais across Central Asia and the Middle East provided water systems, storage facilities, and protective walls capable of hosting hundreds of travelers and animals. Goods from China appeared in European markets. European manufacturing reached Asian cities. African products circulated through the same networks. These weren't random exchanges, they were coordinated trade systems. Yet coordinating trade across thousands of miles without modern communication technology presents a serious challenge. How were prices synchronized? How were contracts enforced? How did merchants coordinate shipments across multiple empires and languages? Even the buildings themselves suggest forgotten purposes. Many older structures contain deep underground chambers with arched brick ceilings and elaborate drainage systems. Official explanations label them as basements or storage areas, yet their engineering often seems far more deliberate. Inside the walls of many buildings are cavities far larger than necessary for basic utilities. Vertical shafts run through multiple floors. Courtyards with glass ceilings create light wells engineered with remarkable precision. Some rooftop structures even align with astronomical positions. Decoration throughout these buildings often follows strict geometric patterns, repeated across continents. Official history calls it architectural style, but the precision suggests something more intentional. Factories of the period raise similar questions. Photographs show massive industrial buildings filled with towering machinery and hundreds of workers operating complex equipment, yet the scale of production seems to appear suddenly. Textile mills in New England were producing millions of yards of fabric by the 1830s. Steel foundries in Germany reached industrial scale within decades. Glassworks in Bohemia, ceramic factories in England, chemical plants in France. Entire industries seem to emerge almost simultaneously. Workers in photographs appear well-trained, operating machines requiring specialized knowledge. Where did the training come from? How did thousands of workers across multiple industries acquire technical skills so quickly? Even commerce suggests systems far more sophisticated than simple barter. Markets coordinated prices across continents. Bills of exchange allowed merchants to conduct transactions internationally. Credit systems and insurance contracts protected shipments across oceans. This was integrated global commerce. Yet it operated before telephones, before wireless communication, and in many cases before the telegraph had become widespread. As night fell, cities transformed again. Street lighting illuminated miles of roads. Gas distribution systems supplied entire neighborhoods through underground pipelines. Indoor plumbing connected homes to pressurized water systems. Heating networks regulated temperatures across large buildings. Ventilation systems controlled airflow with surprising efficiency. By the mid-1800s, many cities already possessed infrastructure that modern engineers still struggle to replicate economically. Which leads to the most difficult question of all. What happened to the knowledge?
Engineering journals from the late 19th century describe sophisticated hydraulic systems, atmospheric experiments, and energy distribution methods. Yet by the early 20th century, many of these discussions vanish. Construction methods.
Change. Architectural knowledge fades. Infrastructure systems are replaced with simpler alternatives. It's almost as if an entire framework of knowledge slowly disappeared. The official narrative insists that technological progress moves in a straight line, that every generation improves upon the last. But the physical evidence doesn't always support that idea. Sometimes it suggests something else entirely. That knowledge can be lost, that civilizations can forget, and that the systems surrounding us may be older, more complex, and more mysterious than we're willing to admit. Walk through Olda.